Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the September webinar of the MERLIN research project, the European Union funded research project. Today, we are quite lucky to have Malte Schneider, the co-founder and managing director of AECO, which is an organization dedicated to restoring peatlands by unlocking their value. Dr. Schneider has over 20 years experience in climate consulting and technology. He led a climate energy policy research group at the ETH in Zurich and has since also built the Climate KIC Startup Accelerator and the Climate Finance Unit. Today he is going to speak about unlocking the potential of carbon credits in freshwater and natural restoration, some practical insights. The format is that we run roughly 30-35 minutes in that range and have time for questions afterward. Please, at any time, you can put a question in the chat. I will be tracking all of them and call you in turn so that Dr. Schneider can concentrate on the answers. Dr. Schneider, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Now I do have an issue here again. Sorry. I try to get that top bar away.
You can't see your screen anyway.
Why not?
That's there, yeah. Sorry.
So I'm sorry for I don't get this top bar away now.
I think it's still okay. We can see your presentation. Okay. Just a few millimeters are missing.
Yeah, I don't know. So as I said in the prep call, I'm not used to Zoom calls as much as I'm used to Microsoft Teams or Google Meet. So everybody excuse myself for that. I hope you will be able to see all the slides well enough. So thanks a lot to the MERLIN team for inviting me. I will be speaking today about the topic that was just announced. I put it here a little bit more specifically, that is going to be about peatland restoration, or at least that's where we as a company, I now have been focusing. Obviously, it's one important ecosystem in the breadth of those that you are looking at. I hope we will learn things together that you can expand to that. I have my set of slides. I'll run through them. As I said before, I'll try to keep it at 30 minutes so that we have ample time to discuss. It's not always easy to strike the right balance between the more detailed and more advanced knowledge and then basics. So I'll try my best to strike a balance to get to the bottom of what we do while still sort of being simple enough to understand. And I was asked to start by maybe before all of the slides giving a very simple explanation of the carbon markets and the voluntary carbon markets, because that's of course the basis of my talk. Now I think you all know that there is emission trading schemes, and these are so-called compliance markets. So there's a regulation in place, for example the power industry in Europe, who emit a lot of CO2 emissions. They're regulated, they're monitored, and they need to bring down their emissions and can trade among each other. Those who can do that more easily will do it and sell their certificates to those that cannot as easily. And over time, the price rises and more people will reduce emissions because the volume goes down. That's the compliance market. The agriculture sector and peatlands, more specifically, obviously is not part of that system. So what we're talking here is the so-called voluntary carbon market. So there's a whole lot of companies out there in the world that are not regulated to reduce their emissions, but because they find it an important contribution to society, or they are pressured by their investors, their stakeholders, their customers. They want to be seen as engaging in climate mitigation. Now, the most obvious place to start is, of course, and should always be, to reduce their own emissions in in their own value chain, in their own operations. Now, on the way to net zero, they will be able to make some progress on that quickly, and hopefully are taking a lot of undertaking lots of efforts to bring emissions down rapidly. But there will be emissions that will remain for quite some while they reduce. And if they want to show that they're taking this even more seriously, then they can, of course, reduce or offset or claim contributions to emission reductions that take place in addition to what they do internally. And that's where then the voluntary carbon markets come in. There's standards and methodologies that allow for developing these projects and making sure that these projects would only take place, for example, with the help of these carbon credits, so the finance that can be obtained from selling these certificates, because if they would happen anyway, then the claim by the buying companies would be hot air. So that's the basics, and we are catering to this market by saying, let's develop peatland restoration projects with high quality, monitor and monetize then the emission reductions that arise from that by selling it to those high quality companies with ambitious claims that want to reduce their emissions even beyond what they do internally. That's the basic. And obviously that provides an additional funding sources to restoration practitioners, one that is hopefully more agile, larger and more scalable, more repeatable than public funding schemes, for which, besides maybe some of the bureaucratic nature that's involved, there's also limited funding naturally to do that. So I hope that was okay as a quick intro. And with that, I'll try to jump in now into the actual slide. And it's important, the subtitle that is listed here is, today you'll hear a private project developer's perspective. So we're a limited liability company and not an NGO, and I'll allude to that fact later on. So today, I'll quickly give you an introduction of who we at AECO are and how we see the world. Then I'll give a very quick overview of where the carbon markets stand and what happens in the peatland space. And then I will dive a little bit deeper around the methodologies or the science behind the methodologies that are used to quantify emissions, even though they are still at quite a nascent state. And then I'll run you through an example of how to do a peatland project, give a bit of a view on what we feel is needed to further advance carbon crediting as a means to really scale up peatland restoration. And then probably one of the most important sections is, how are we doing this, and how are we doing this collaboratively with different organizations across various countries, and how maybe we could collaborate in the future. So AECO in a nutshell, we have come up with a business model, a kind of a platform with which we try to provide balanced incentives for all stakeholders. What does that mean? So we do the assessment of sites, we develop them, we plan them, we implement them, we monitor the water level increases and the resulting CO2 emissions. We sell them in the market, and obviously with that we can try to bring in investors. Now, we do all of that. We bring in investors that are interested in a true sustainable return, green investments. They provide us with upfront capital. We can then sell high quality credits to corporates, enterprises that want to show that they're ambitiously engaging in the climate protection agenda. But to get to the projects and to implement them, we need people on the ground with the detailed knowledge around the ecosystems, the actors, the permissioning processes in different geographies. And that's why we look at collaborating with restoration and conservation NGOs or other multipliers that we would incentivize as well. And finally, of course, the land stewards, being the owners and the farmers, who need to be incentivized. And they do not need to cover any of the investment costs. So we do all of that, and we more or less say, hey, and you get X% of the carbon revenues. Now, our plan is to grow quite ambitiously in 3 phases. Now, lots of you will say, wow, that's too ambitious. But let's be frank, so much has to be done in this space that if we start with too small a goal, then we feel that we won't reach anywhere. So that's the game plan here. We are in a pilot phase, and we'll try to get to 1,000 hectares under implementation until 2025. We'll then aim to ramp up significantly in the following 3 years, and then the race will be on towards scaling to 100,000 hectares and hopefully more by 2030 and onwards. If you see these kinds of targets and you know your sector, then you know quite well that that is difficult for a number of reasons, and that's why we as a company, we are, and we'll come to that at the end of the presentation again, we are implementing a standardized process. We have developed a version that, of course, we are iterating continuously and adapting to special cases, but it's important in our view to go from identifying, so sourcing a potential site, screening it remotely, screening it on site, doing some more detailed feasibility assessment, doing a deal with the landowners and farmers, to the planning, implementation, and monitoring, etc. All of that needs to follow a repeatable process or standardized modular process that we and partners can use and develop a common language around to make that happen more easily. We are underpinning that as well by a software, because we're trying to sort of then pour all of that know-how, that process, into a software that we can use collaboratively with our partners to advance a portfolio of projects effectively through the entire life cycle. Now that's us here, just to show some faces. You'll see the rest of the team and some statement about who we're looking for to join the team up on top. So it's Max and myself, the original sort of co-founders and managing directors, and very quickly afterwards we were joined by Christian, who is our true peatland expert. Max and I more come from a more general climate tech, sustainable policy, science, and startup entrepreneurship view. And of course, we have a board, in this case, a quite small one still, Franziska Tanneberg, whom most of you probably know from the Greifswald Meyer Center, and a sustainability consultant that helps more with a corporate perspective. So that was very quickly who we are at AECO. Now, the carbon market, more generally, is, and don't be sort of shocked now by the graphics here. The top graphic shows you some price projections by Ernst & Young, and there's many out there that are slightly different, but it shows you, that's the global price estimate here, that the prices are expected to go up quite steeply for the voluntary carbon market, and that includes lots of the deforestation projects or other things in the global south. So our assumption is that, and actually the market mirrors that already, that peatland projects in Europe will trade at a higher price, because there's a price premium on high quality projects around the corner of European companies who want to do something next door. You can also see then in the line below where the markets stand. So at the moment, it's a 2 billion market, the voluntary carbon market, and there's lots of projections out there, but most of them say or foresee a very steep increase. So here is one that shows 50 billion by 2030 and 100 by 2050. It really doesn't matter if that's 50% up or down, and so that varies widely, but the projections all point to a very substantial increase. And over time, this will be complemented by an increase in biodiversity markets that probably will take the shape of biodiversity credit markets, although there is still a lot of uncertainty, a lot that needs to be developed, and therefore, and likewise for other ecosystems like water retention, filtration, etc. that's something for the future. We very much hope that these things will kick in, because our view is on peatlands more holistically, but the carbon markets is what is the key if you want to build a scalable model at the moment. Now, you all will have read articles, etc., or come across news snippets in the last years, and will have realized that there is quite some contentious debate around these voluntary carbon markets. There was quite a bit of turbulence despite these projections. There was a surfacing of some of the inherent weaknesses of the market, especially for some project categories. And therefore, lots of initiatives have been emerging to improve and safeguard the integrity of these markets. So the governance and quality of these standards and their methodologies is one focus. For example, there's a big body that's called the Integrity Council of the Voluntary Carbon Markets that existing standards with their methodologies can apply to get an approval. And then there's also a more strong focus now on the various claims that buyers of these certificates can make. So, for example, there's a tendency away from offsetting emissions rather to contributing to emission reductions, or just a certain part of my emissions can be offset. But I don't want to go into the detail, as that is a rabbit hole for such a webinar. There's other issues as well. One of them is whether a carbon credit is actually removing CO2 out of the atmosphere, or it's just avoiding the release. That's a very, very important one as well. And the interesting thing around peatland, as many of you will know, is that initially peatlands are mostly an avoidance solution. So trying to keep the peat in the ground rather than having it go up in the air. The actual accumulation of new peat, and therefore removing additional CO2 out of the atmosphere, that always then comes on top, or can come on top, but not at all in all projects, and not to the extent that emissions can be avoided. The peatland carbon market is fragmented. So that's what this is, I guess, showing you. Don't try to understand everything on that slide. If you want to look at it with a bit of a focus, then look at what's in the dotted lines. So you might have heard about Verra. Verra is the world's largest voluntary carbon market standard. It's called the Voluntary Carbon Standard, and it's managed by Verra. There is one methodology that exists since a long time that hasn't been applied, really. The only peat relevant projects that have been done under Verra are those that are peat forests, and they have been done under the category of reducing emissions from avoided deforestation. There is the UK Peatland Code, which is the one mechanism that shows the most dynamic at the moment, although also there, not many projects have actually issued and sold certificates. And there is the More Futures, which is a German standard, where there's, I think, 15 or 20 projects, or maybe 15 so far, and we have worked towards changing that one, and are working on an adaptation of that methodology to allow for an ex post verification of the actual water level increases and the emissions. Below, you see lots of other standards, and there is ones that are not on here. I think in the Netherlands, there's also one called Valuta for Spain or something. All that is to say the market is quite fragmented. All of these standards and methodologies do not have that many projects yet. And therefore, there's also not so much of a consolidation. And that's what we would like to see more. Especially one that covers all kinds of peatland settings. There is an issue around data availability in certain regions. There is issues around forested peatlands and how you measure the emissions from those. And therefore, we have now opted for one approach for those of you interested, where we developed a very focused methodology based on Vera's existing one under a new international high quality standard, which is called social carbon. And we will want to add other modules as we go. Another initiative that is trying to develop methodologies in the peatland space is, of course, the EU with its carbon removal and certification framework was the original name. I think now it's the carbon removal and carbon farming regulation. So their work is underway as well to develop a set of methodologies. So that's where this standard, the market is. Maybe before I go into the science, what's important though is there's lots of interest, and we see that already, lots of interest from buyers to be investing into peatland restoration projects, because it's a different kind of category. It's happening here in Europe. It's more easily proven. Something actually needs to be invested, and you can go visit it essentially. So I think that's why there is a lot of appetite, and you know how big the policy pressure is as well. Now, the science behind this is that the whole approach to quantifying peatland emissions. There's one very important paper or approach out there which has said we need to develop greenhouse gas emission site types. And the origin of that thinking is that direct GHG measurements are too costly, and therefore we need proxies. And there has been a lot of work done, and then the result is that you see, oh, okay, water level is one very, very important proxy for CO2 emissions. Therefore, it has been in a strong focus. However, water level measurements are often not existing, as you probably will know, especially in the baseline scenario, so in the current state of an ecosystem. And water level measurements are assumed to be costly in a project scenario. Therefore, one has looked at other proxies, and vegetation has been proven to be a good one to estimate soil moisture classes, which can be translated into summer and winter median water levels. And then you can add in land use type, and then you can identify or attribute an emission factor to a broader sort of greenhouse gas emission site type, such as dry to moderately moist grassland or moist grassland. There's 42 of these GASTs, but only, I think, 10 or 12 have been published peer-reviewed so far. These are more granular than IPCC emission factors, but they do not cover all settings, and they need to be still published in their entirety. So that's, by the way, important. I'm not talking as a peatland scientist. I'm talking here as a company that tries to use the best available science to get this market to scale. This, I think, is maybe a little bit too complicated. I want to say one thing, how we approach this. The vegetation we use to estimate water levels in the baseline scenario, because indeed, oftentimes we do not have water loggers installed in the peatlands we want to re-wet. Therefore, we go and do a detailed vegetation analysis to arrive at the baseline scenario emissions. If we have implemented re-wetting measures, then we would rely on water level measurements and do so remotely, even to have a real-time view on the water level across the year. And with these things, we can then allocate emissions both to the baseline and more accurately, more continuously to the project scenario. So this should have read differently. Now I'm running you through very quickly how one would develop a peatland restoration project using the carbon finance approach. So how would you do a baseline assessment? You would look at a there's an example site here, and you would, in the first step, define the eligible project area. So you would look at the peat distribution and apply a minimum peat depth threshold that can be 30 centimeters, or with exceptions, 20 centimeters. And you do that with a number of peat corings, obviously. In the second instance, you would then do a vegetation mapping along transects, and even establish plots to monitor vegetation in a more detailed form. And you would then translate that into soil moisture classes projected onto the entire site. And in a third step, then be able to allocate emissions to a stratified map of that peatland. And then you would obviously store all of that data, how you arrived at these baseline emissions, so that in case the science changes or the methodologies changes, you can go back if you're challenged and say, well, this is how we determined the baseline scenario and why we argue that these X or Y tons of CO2 have come out per year out of that peatland. You can see already from this process, there's lots of manual and expert work to be done, and therefore there's ample room for innovation around possibly how to use drone data, ground penetration radars, simplify how you project vegetation data onto the entire site, etc. If you have done that, you would then go on to doing the project scenario quantification. This is now the approach that we are following. So we would install remote readout water loggers. We're with a partner startup developing an own version of that to lower the costs, to be able to install enough of them. We would calibrate a statistical model to project water level onto the entire site. We would then do the yearly monitoring of these water levels, and of course keep on monitoring, in very simple terms, the land use, whether and how that changes. And that then again would allow us to do the categorization into GAST, into emission factors for the various parts of the peatland site. This then allows us, and again on the right-hand side, that's just an example calculation for one side where you have the emission factors on the left for the baseline scenario, on the right for the project scenario, and different types of, different parts of that peatland belong into different categories. You sum that up and you arrive at yearly emission reductions, the way that we want to address that site, of 7.8 tons. Once you've done that, then you supply your data regularly to a verifier, third-party verifier, who gives it their analysis and their stamp, and then you are issued credits which you can sell. Again, you see lots of manual work to be done, ample room for improvements. Now, what actions are needed to further advance peatland restoration via carbon crediting? Our sort of vision is that we need a peatland restoration industry. And I think for many of you coming from the NGO sector, that sounds frightening. We don't mean that by to say that there's no guardrails and no high integrity criteria in place, not at all. But we are absolutely convinced that without the private sector mobilizing finance, capabilities, etc., we will not at all be able to deliver on the challenge that we have. So the list you see here is what we can do as private sector, including ongoing incentives models for land stewards. We can collaborate with the likes of you to reach out and quickly develop these sites. We can do the financial engineering to, front load future certificate sales to an investment today. That's a very important point. And of course, we would make available the data we collect as part of the carbon standard monitoring systems. We can provide that data based on agreements to the scientific partners to be able to then improve the way that proxy monitoring, etc., is done. But we need science and data to take further steps. Peatland science, I always tend to say, is 25 years or so behind the forest science around estimating at least above ground biomass in forests. And I think it needs still a large push to go ahead to be able to provide these emission factors for a wider variety of peatland settings and geographies. And we need a policy and market framework that helps then with coming up with a consensus around which data to use and how these carbon market schemes are actually then compatible with other schemes or are transformed into real long-term stable frameworks. Most of all, though, let's get started. Now, finally, this section is our approach, and I've highlighted it in the beginning a little bit, and how one can collaborate with us. So we have this process, and we are, as I said, developing a software to help with this that is can be operated by us together with partners. And we're currently focusing on these early stages of the process because obviously peatlands are difficult. Oftentimes there's complex situations. Can they be re-wetted or not? Is enough carbon coming out or not? How many owners are there? How many farmers are there? What are competing water table sort of constraints? And so we go step by step through this, and we work with partners that know their regions or certain owners or farmers themselves to try to source these projects, and together with them go through a screening phase where we do a remote screening, then they go on site and confirm many important things. Then we try to do an LOI with the most important owners and farmers to be able to have somebody as an anchor partner locally. And then we would go on into more detailed feasibility studies, get all stakeholders to provide us with a general go and direction of where it needs to go. And then we would commission external experts if needed to go even deeper. And from that, we take it to financial modeling, final contracts, planning, implementation, etc. Now, so far, we have established partnerships in Poland with CMOC, in Lithuania with Beth. In Latvia, we're working with an individual. We are in discussions around Ukraine with, for example, the Suko Foundation, but also with a local partner. And we're keen to develop more partnerships in other or even the same countries with maybe specific networks or specialities that can help us do that. We need support with project sourcing and screening and sort of feasibility studies and getting to contacts with the local owners and farmers and authorities, because that whole stakeholder game is one that we cannot solve from a distance without having somebody locally. What you can get in return, obviously, we make available our standardized tool. We provide materials, information, capacity building, and there is a success fee that we propose, but the details of that would be there's no standardized models yet. So if you're interested, please reach out to us and we can see if that is of interest, and then we could see how one could try to take next steps toward a partnership. There's also one other way to work with us. We are recruiting. You see that on the right-hand side. So a senior peatland project developer with a sort of ample experience in peatland wetting vegetation, ideally also GHG emissions from peatland know-how, or a senior hydrological restoration partner. The GIS specialist, we are likely to already have found somebody, but if you're interested anyway, please get in touch. It's not easy, as you know, to find experts in this space who are willing to go work with a private sector player who wants to really scale up and therefore bring sort of the nature, the ecosystem, the on-site, the field experience together with a with a scalability mindset. So looking at many sites, trying to systematically improve that. If that fascinates you, we would be happy to hear from you. Okay, I think it's now over the time, but we started late, and but I hope I didn't run over time too much. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schneider. Very clear, and actually, we appreciate within time. We've had much bigger runovers than this. We do have 2 questions so far, but please put a question into the chat at any time. I'll be watching that while Dr. Schneider is answering. The first question comes from Richard Field of the University of Nottingham. The question is, how is uncertainty accounted for, especially in the vegetation form GST approach? You use vegetation to infer about water level, which you then use to infer about carbon. Each act of inference involves considerable uncertainty or error.
That is true. So obviously, the carbon markets tackle that more generally with the guidance to be conservative. So whenever there is a choice to be made, you would go towards the more conservative approach. In doing your greenhouse gas balance, we would leave out certain emissions also, like N2O. There is other ways to be conservative, but I think keeping in mind there's also buffers in these carbon market schemes, and the emission factors themselves have been established in a way that they present a good middle ground. Now, of course, if you really take it to the max and you say each individual site needs to be perfect, then you will always go to the absolutely most conservative value, which would almost render any project very difficult to implement. But if you look at a sort of a carbon market in many projects, then that cancels out as well. That's one answer. But yes, it's an issue. Conservativeness is what you tackle, what you use to tackle it, and we're welcoming any scientific developments that help us even characterize that uncertainty better, but improve the foundational data. And we cannot, and that's our main point, we cannot wait for the science to try to become perfect on this before we start really scaling up peatland restoration. So working with these values in a conservative manner and being open to revisit them once more information comes in. That's what I said with storing the data. That's our approach and the carbon markets approach.
Okay, thank you. The following question from Stefano Gamberoni. Which standard does your workflow follow?
Okay, that's the workflow. So it's important to say that the carbon standard is one important element, but let's not be fooled here. For us, we need to assess a whole lot of other things as well, because a peatland might be a good carbon project under the Vera standard, the social carbon, or the UK peatland code. But to prove that, you need to do a whole lot of other checks, and you need to, get the permissions. You need to bring on board the farmers, the owners, in different ways. So the process is driven not by a particular standard, but by the entire process of doing a project under a carbon standard. Then, depending on in which geography you are, or what peatland type it is, would we adjust or fine-tune the inputs based on the specific requirements of a standard? But they are not so wildly different then that it's entirely different processes. So we can cover them all, and we will get more fine-tuned to address the specifics of each along the way.
The third question comes from Hein Bohn of RPP. Do you have a rule of thumb regarding costs for preparing a cutover peatland for the purpose of re-wetting / restoration?
Okay, let's answer another question first, and please get him to explain to me better what a cutover peatland is, if that's possible.
Okay, I'm going to have to ask Hein either to write that in the chat or to pipe up, unmute your mic and respond.
Maybe he can just type it in and you read out another question in the meantime.
Okay, while he's doing that, or from Hélène Perrier of the European Commission, do you see biodiversity certificates / credits as a potential additional source of finance? And how do you see the potential market in this field?
Well, that's a very important question. We are absolutely convinced that we need to look at peatlands holistically and not with a carbon tunnel. So we do need to, and then to scale up peatlands, there will be cases, peatland restoration, there will be cases where carbon finance alone won't be enough, or even the carbon element is not really essential anymore, but you need to do other things to bring back other important and vital ecosystem services. So we are increasingly bringing that into focus and are developing projects along that way, or initiatives. I think it's a far cry. It would be not sort of humble if I knew now, or said I knew where the market goes. I think there is a lot of momentum or push towards biodiversity credits, but it will take a few years, unfortunately, until that really settles in along some standard ways, because biodiversity is so much different. Carbon markets are already difficult, but there is at least one metric, which is CO2 equivalence. And so that's the big challenge, but we are on it, and we are in discussions with, for example, the communities that are trying to preserve and bring back the aquatic warbler, so one of the key species around well-functioning fen mires. So yes, we do see potential and we do see the need. I think it will take time to develop the nuts and bolts of it.
Okay, in the meantime, Hein Bohn, if I'm pronouncing that name correctly, has typed in cutover peatland is finished / exhausted peatland, possibly with 0,5 to 1 meter peat left.
So in principle, 0.5 to 1 meter of peat left, that's enough. Yeah, that's enough to do a carbon project, because we want to keep that 0.5 to 1 meter in the ground permanently. So that's that. The cost will vary widely. Before I say a few words to the cost element, there is one challenge though to that. If I get you right, it sounds almost like you're talking peat excavation sites. That's still quite difficult methodologically, because on these sites in the baseline, if they're not under excavation anymore, one could argue that there might be a spontaneous afforestation, reforestation happening. So these peatlands would draw down carbon in the baseline. So how do you then say, if you re-wet it, the science is not that clear yet, although everybody agrees it's beneficial and it's positive from a climate balance. It's not easy, or nobody has really had the courage to say, establish an emission factor, by how much a re-wetted excavated peat site is better than an excavated open one that spontaneously reforests. Sorry for that quite complicated sub-answer. If you're interested in that, please get in touch with us. We're trying to find pragmatic solutions to that. In terms of cost, is really, and that's why also we do this process as we do it. It depends so much on the local conditions, the water availability, the water infrastructure. We always say that the top priority would be a polder site where there is enough water and the water management infrastructure is still quite okay or can be rehabilitated quickly or improved, because that then would lend itself to easy and quick implementation, and even sort of allow the farmer and the owner the perspective that water levels can be managed in important situations. So please come talk to me or contact me if you have a specific site in mind or category, and then we do an online or remote quick discussion around that.
Thank you. The next question comes from Elias van Straten. Is the regional focus only EU or also open to other geographical areas?
Yeah, another good question. Although, no, of course, we would like to do this globally, but I think we need to, the EU already is large and quite a big challenge. So we're focusing on the EU and, let's say, adjacent countries. So the one country where we're, putting our toe in the water is Ukraine. Once we get rolling more, have learned sort of the basics better, in a variety of contexts, etc. We're happy to work outside of Europe as well, in different formats. And we might even do that opportunistically soon. But at the moment, our top-down strategic focus is to crack the European issue.
The next question comes from Emeke Jirshvi. Has your company considered doing or did similar assessments on other wetlands, such as floodplains of rivers, pre and post restoration of the river?
So in principle, we are peatland focused. So if you have a peated flood meadow, we can talk about that. Otherwise, we will not put this into the main focus at the moment. But I mean, in case we scale as we foresee and develop the processes, the networks, the implementation know-how across a number of European countries, then it's a pretty small step towards saying, okay, let's try to tackle other ecosystems as well.
The next question is from B. Peroni. How do you take into account the different climate regions in Europe? For example, North Europe and Shout. I'm not sure what Shout is.
Probably south, just spelled wrongly. I mean, the easy answer to that is we would be looking at the moment. We are mainly looking at Germany, Poland, the Baltics, Ukraine, and we're in discussion with partners in the UK. If it's in the UK, then it would be the peatland code and gives a certain, that then we can't choose freely, but that's pretty clearly defined, at least for the bogs. We have, while writing this new methodology developing this agricultural land methodology under social carbon, it's under, by the way, under public comment period, if you want to comment, and probably will be launched by end of September. We encountered also, again, in the review process with experts, that of course the science that we work with, mostly this GAST approach, stems from work that has been done in Northeastern Europe mainly, or Eastern Europe, and it can be expanded or applied, but of course, keeping in mind that this will vary locally. So that's a nod towards the conservative issue again, conservativeness. Other areas might not have such a wide empirical base, but we have included in this methodologies and the possibility to try to point towards data from at least, I don't know what it was, 2-3 peer-reviewed publications that clearly make the case for a certain emission factor for a similar peatland, ideally with an expert judgment, with 2 expert judgments that are submitted as part of the project documentation, so also publicly available, making that point, to circumvent the problem that, yeah, the science is just not there in as many areas as we would like to. So there's areas, especially Northeast, where we know more, and then there's areas where we know less, and we are committed to help wherever we can, and we hope that the public sector will continue to fund work to improve the database, but we're willing to make pragmatic arguments based on best available, rather specific data around certain regions to just get going. Because the most important thing is, if we, you know, we can die trying to come up with a perfect science. Let's get going and acknowledge some of the issues while we focus also on investing into the science that's needed to make things even better. Sorry for that rambling answer. It's a reflection of the issues of that market or that science.
The next question comes from Marianne Henkel. Thank you for a rich presentation, Dr. Schneider. A stakeholder-related question. In Germany, in many regions, we are facing substantive opposition to re-wetting projects from local communities, mostly farmers. What are your experiences in this regard? Are you engaging with these stakeholders, or whose job is this kind of stakeholder engagement under your approach? Thanks.
Well, thanks for the flowers first, and secondly, I mean that's probably the key question in many regards. So the first point here is that we think that carbon finance recurring revenues allow us to depart from models that have been used in the past and that have not worked. So trying to tell somebody that either, oh, look, we cover the restoration cost and then you re-wet the peatland. I mean, why would they do it? The farmer can't, you know, operate the land anymore in the way that he thought he wanted to. The owner says, well, the value of my peatland goes down. Why would anybody say yes? Of course, then there was offers of compensation payments or even buying the site, etc. That has also dried up somewhat because people often don't want to sell the land because they also have an identity connection. So they rather want to see how that land can be kept under their sort of umbrella, but continue to generate revenues. So that's where we think carbon revenues come in and make a substantial shift in the thinking. So you get money on a recurring basis if you do that. Then there is the question around, you shouldn't start with the most complicated project. So part of our screening is to try to weed out those things that are prone to be difficult. And, you know, we have these elections on Sunday. So in the Northeast, for example, in Europe, in Germany, there is quite a few people out of ideological reasons that would oppose that. So the more diverse the set of actors and owners and farmers, etc., is, and the larger the number, the less likely it is to get going quickly. Then we have tried to couple this with also cap payments where possible, where we say we finance some of the additional measures and take along the owner, whereas the farmer is compensated for higher cost and lower yield by specific cap schemes. That's a possible way to bundle these things. So I think we have some solutions, and I'm happy to talk about it and want to conclude with the following point. Local actors, local NGO chapters, or even, you know, agriculture consultants, like they did with PV plants or wind plants. We can develop, we can imagine quite many models of how to work together with partners. We cannot do the knocking on doors, the drinking tea, the eating a bratwurst on every local market to get people on board. We can't and will not do that. So we want to identify partners where there's a mutual fit, with financial support, but also just in terms of vision and mission, and then build on their local expertise and networks and support them in providing the materials, the incentives, and the expertise to move these projects along more quickly. Another long question, but I hope I answered it. Yeah. Hello?
Sorry.
Yes.
You may study, from Finland, Tina is asking, you may study different options for restoration and after use of peat extraction site, also via MERLIN project websites, Finnish case study, Kompasuo. I would be keen to hear whether you have plans to do restoration in Finland, as we do have lots of peatlands that should be restored. Biggest question is how to finance the action.
Please get in contact. We would be very happy to do that. One of the challenges in Finland is the availability of agreed emission factors for forested peatlands. That's where a scientific debate rages. But let's jump on a call if you're interested and see which kind of sites you're talking about. If we can tackle them methodologically, and I know there's also adjustments to a Vera methodology going on from Finnish partners that might make that possible. We are more than open to work in Finland.
Finally, there is an invitation from Francisco Lorenzo Correa. Dr. Schneider, thank you for the presentation. Please visit Ponte de Lima, and he gives a link which I will forward to you, or you can see it in the chat. So
sounds great.
Okay. I can now turn it to the floor. If anybody still has a question, other than that, all the questions in the chat have been answered quite well. I think you have satisfied every curiosity. Thank you very much, Dr. Schneider, and it was a pleasure. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I have to announce also that the next webinar will be on the 7th of October, which is coming right up a few weeks from today. Are there any further announcements, Astrid or Jörg?
Not from my side. Thanks a lot. It was a very nice presentation.
Just wanted to say the next webinar will be about the ECO Advance project, which deals with advancing ecological restoration in Europe. But otherwise, thank you, Malte, for your clear and nice presentation. It was a pleasure to listen to you.
Thanks, everybody. And get in contact if you have peatland sites, want to work together, or even join the team. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you.